Back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to look at the Bush administration as they deal with the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. Make sure that you have open in Google Classroom the doc that goes along with this. So you can fill out the answers as we go through the lesson. I would suggest you have the lesson itself playing on a secondary device so it's easier for you to type in the answers. If you look at some of the objectives here in 20.2 Part 2, we'll be looking at the impact of the terrorist attacks on the United States, how this kind of drags the United States into additional areas around the world in terms of foreign policy involvement. And we'll look at some of the other issues of George W. Bush's second term. If you see the image there, obviously that was the aftermath of the first plane hitting one of the towers. You see the second plane coming to hit the second tower, and that's when we knew we were under attack. Obviously, you guys are too young to physically remember. You weren't alive back then. But in the case of the United States and the world, the first plane that hit the tower, they thought might have been an accident. But then once the second one hit the second tower, we knew that we were under attack. So that's kind of a key point to understand. So if you look at the goal of what the terrorists were attempting to accomplish, terrorism is the use of violence by a non-government group against civilians in order to achieve a political goal. It's designed to instill fear amongst the people or to terrorize them. So in the case of their goals, they accomplished their goals. Obviously, the country retreated inward. The economy took a significant downward trend. There's a lot of death, devastation, and fear as a result of the attacks. Also created a sense of when something was going to happen next. Now, the difference between a terrorist act and war, obviously, if a country, a foreign country attacks you in a similar fashion, that's war, opposed to a rogue group like the Al-Qaeda terrorist network that attacked us on 9/11. There is a kind of nuance there. Sometimes you have what is called state-sponsored terrorism. That's when governments, for example, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, who historically have secretly funded terrorist activities. This includes attacks against Israel, a neighboring country in the Middle East that obviously a lot of these Middle Eastern countries do not have a positive view of. Okay, looking at bin Laden's background, he's the mastermind or the leader of the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, the person who we put the most blame on in regard to carrying out the terrorist attacks. He was from one of the more wealthy families in Saudi Arabia. He did fight with Afghan rebels in the 70s and 80s during the equivalency of the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, where they attempted to take over a smaller, less powerful country in Afghanistan, and the rebels kind of held them off until the Soviet Union finally withdrew. He started Al-Qaeda in 1988. He was outraged during Gulf War I when the United States and our allies staged troops in Saudi Arabia. He kind of viewed Westerners in the United States and our allies as invaders. After the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan and the United States fled Somalia after Black Hawk Down, he believed that he could influence, terrorize, and ultimately defeat the superpowers. So he didn't like the Soviet Union or the United States. Al-Qaeda literally means the base of support for terrorism and for bin Laden's ideology. It's the group that is responsible for the 9/11 attack, as well as other attacks throughout history, and even in the aftermath of 9/11, additional attacks as well. Bin Laden, he established his terrorist camps in Afghanistan, and he dedicated himself to driving Westerners completely out of the Middle East. Okay, when you look at the impact and the devastation of the 9/11 attacks in 2001, 266 passengers and crew members on the 4 hijacked planes died. 125 people died at the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people died in New York City. It was a coordinated 4-plane hijacking, with 2 of the planes obviously hitting the Twin Towers respectively, 1 hitting the Pentagon, and the 4th plane was taken down by the passengers and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That plane was allegedly, and we can only speculate, was heading for another target in the Washington, D.C. area, perhaps the Capitol building or the White House. You can see the newspaper headline, and that's just one example of countless hundreds of headlines across the world after the attack. So now the United States and the world look to President Bush, who was only in the presidency for a little less than 8 months at the time of the attacks. So they look to Bush to see how he would rally the country. Like Franklin Roosevelt, Bush said the attacks had been deliberate, implying they were planned out. In multiple speeches, he defined the enemy as evil and despicable. He meant these speeches to bring the American people together. And eventually this would lead us into strikes in Afghanistan in an attempt to find Osama bin Laden and take out the al-Qaeda terrorist network. One of the most famous incidents, and I included a link on the document for this little film clip. So if you want to hear the little speech here, is kind of one of the more patriotic moments in the aftermath of 9/11. That's President Bush visiting with first responders who are on the rubble and grounds of the Twin Towers. And the president kind of rallied the people, and there's a lot of chants of USA and things like that there. So the American economy was devastated as we look at 23. They caused widespread uncertainty among businesses and consumers. The attacks hit the airline and travel industries particularly hard because people were reluctant to travel. You could see some parallels between the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and what we're dealing with here in the 2020 pandemic. In many ways, it kind of shuts down normal activities. Then in October 2001, additional fear was spread amongst citizens as there was a series of packages and envelopes that were sent to different locations that it contained anthrax, which obviously is a chemical that can kill you. This spread additional paranoia and fear. People believed that terrorists were going to use biological weapons to attack the United States in broader attacks. And this increased the need in the minds of the Bush administration and his advisors for a war on terror. On September 14th, 2001, Congress authorized the use of force to fight terrorists. Intelligence sources in the government quickly identified the attacks as the work of bin Laden and his al-Qaeda terrorist network. And you can see here President Bush giving a speech where he declared a war on terror. He also delivered an ultimatum to the Taliban, which was the leadership in Afghanistan. They had the opportunity to capture, arrest, and turn over bin Laden for prosecution in the United States and to close all the terrorist camps. Or, as President Bush said, they would face dire consequences. In addition to military force, President Bush, in his first step in regard to the war on terror, cut off funding, froze assets of any groups that were linked to the terrorist organizations or suspected of aiding terrorists. So it was an attempt to economically strangle the supporters of bin Laden's terrorist network. In an attempt to streamline intelligence in the country and prevent additional terrorist attacks in the future, President Bush got Congress to help create the Office of Homeland Security. This allowed the coordination of all federal agencies. One of the biggest problems, as we found out in regard to the intelligence failures that led to the 9/11 attacks, there was enough puzzle pieces that if you had put the puzzle together with the information you had, you might have known something was coming. But the different organizations, FBI, CIA, national security agencies, all these different agencies operated separately with their information. They did not share this information. So the Office of Homeland Security is designed to filter all that information to one source so that you can look at the entire puzzle all at once and kind of put those pieces together. Another big change in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks was the United States Patriot Act, signed into law in October 2001. This allowed for the government to conduct searches, wiretaps, look at personal data searches in an effort to combat terrorism. Something as simple as your library card usage could now be checked by the government. So let's say you're taking out books on bomb making and terrorism and things like that. They can kind of put those pieces together, and it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be arrested, but it does mean that, let's say, a local authority might be called in to interview you to see why you're maybe taking those books out. What happened with anthrax in October 2001? There were a series of anthrax attacks via regular mail delivery. Anthrax, a deadly bacterium, was sent to members of Congress. A Florida newspaper editor and 2 postal workers died from it. And you can see the different spots here: Kansas City, Indianapolis, New York City, Princeton and Hamilton, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Boca Raton and Lake Worth, Florida, were all spots where anthrax was sent. There's an envelope that was sent to Senator Daschle. He was the Democratic leader in the Senate, and he received anthrax in that envelope. So it was really, people were basically fearing a lot of regular activities based on some of these terroristic acts. On October 7th, 2001, the United States began bombing targets in Afghanistan. The United States began destroying al-Qaeda training camps. We removed the Taliban from power in Afghanistan. We helped to install a democratic government in Afghanistan. There was a lot of restrictions on citizens in Afghanistan. So something as simple as children playing with toys and flying kites was banned in their country, but now we're seeing that for the very first time. Female children who were not going to school were now going to school for the first time in Afghanistan. So we were seeing some positive events occurring in Afghanistan as a result of American involvement. If you look at the map here, just to kind of get a visualization of the location of Afghanistan. So you have Iran that borders here. You have Pakistan to the southeast. You can see China. You see these are former Soviet Union republics: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. So when the Soviet Union controlled these regions here, the natural next step for them in regard to their geographic boundaries was to go into Afghanistan to extend their control in the Middle East. And so that's kind of the rationale as to why they went in there during the late 70s into the 80s. In a January 2002 speech, remembered as President Bush's Axis of Evil speech, President Bush's main contention, and you can see there the 3 countries represented on the map, and that's the photograph from his speech. President Bush meant that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea made up an axis of evil. These are countries the United States must deal with. He alleged these countries were attempting to develop weapons of mass destruction and support terrorist organizations. Now, of course, in subsequent years, we've dealt with North Korea and their leaders and their testing of nuclear weapons. So, too, we've had many issues with Iran in regard to trying to get them to stop their program to develop nuclear weapons. And, of course, we would have a war with Iraq maybe a year or so after this speech. 34, what proof did the United States have in regard to Iraq and its dictator that Saddam Hussein was willing to use chemical weapons. So some of the rationale for going into Iraq uh, shortly after this speech was the idea that Hussein was somebody who could not be trusted, somebody who might use weapons of mass destruction. He had twice used chemical weapons against Iran and also on his own people. He used chemical weapons in northern Iraq as he attempted to slaughter an ethnic group in Iraq, the Kurds. '35, what did UN inspectors conclude after Gulf War I that ended in 1991? Iraq had biological weapons and was working on a nuclear bomb. So that was kind of the report from the UN that we were dealing with. 36, what did President Bush state about Iraq during the summer of 2002? He called for a regime change. He said in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the United States cannot tolerate rogue dictators in power, for example, Hussein in Iraq. He asked for a UN resolution demanding that Iraq give up weapons of mass destruction and made it clear that with or without UN support, Hussein was out. His time was up. So President Bush viewed it as too dangerous of a world to kind of let Hussein remain in power. Those critics argue it's not the United States' job to remove people from power in other countries. Other people supported the idea that Hussein had already done enough negative things throughout his time in power that this was a necessary step. Generally speaking, in a bipartisan vote, meaning that Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly voted to go to war with Iraq in the aftermath of this speech and some of this rationale here. Ultimately, a coalition of roughly 30 countries led by the United States and Great Britain attacked Iraq in March of 2003. In about 6 weeks of fighting, the Iraqi army was defeated. Hussein's two sons, Uday and Qusay, were killed. Hussein himself was captured, tried. He was put on trial by the Iraqi government that was now in power, and he was executed for crimes against his people. What has occurred in Iraq since the fall of Hussein? Iraq wrote a democratic constitution, has held multiple elections, has taken control of their country. Unfortunately, fighting continues amongst different ethnic groups in Iraq. U.S. troops remain there in an attempt to stabilize Iraq right into the Obama administration. One of the more dramatic events during the American involvement in Iraq, you can see there that's a statue of Saddam Hussein, and an American military is dragging the statue down, and it's crumbling to the ground, a sign that Hussein's time in Iraq had come to an end. '42, what is meant by habeas corpus? What does it have to do with the actions of Bush after 9/11? This is a right to a fair trial. It's kind of like a basic constitutional right. Bush decided that as he captured enemy combatants abroad, that they would be sent instead to Guantanamo Bay, which became a prison camp basically for enemy combatants, or be held accountable by a military tribunal instead of a civilian court. So some people felt that this was kind of suspending citizens' rights to a trial. Very often these were non-American citizens, so the argument by the government was they weren't entitled to the same American rights as an American citizen might have. Okay, looking at other issues in Bush's second term. In 2004, it was going to be a pretty close election, as there was some uncertainty about American involvement in Iraq at this point in time. Americans weren't sure that was the right decision. The Democrats nominated a longtime senator from Massachusetts, John Kerry. He ran with John Edwards, another senator from North Carolina. He won a much more convincing victory than he did in 2000. Of course, he lost the popular vote and barely won in 2000, so any margin of victory greater than that would be a net positive for Bush's campaign. This time, the state that was closest was Ohio, and that was a state, too, that John Kerry had some optimism that he could win. Ultimately, he lost, and President Bush won a little bit more comfortable victory in 2004 than he did in 2000. President Bush faced several challenges during his second term. The biggest challenge was the aftermath and the events surrounding Hurricane Katrina. Many people felt he did not respond quickly enough to the hurricane, which occurred in August of 2005. The hurricane, you can see the photograph on the left, is basically the roofs of homes that are basically completely submerged in the flooding that occurred after the hurricane came through. And then probably the biggest issue for the entire country involved the recession that occurred very late in Bush's presidency, started in 2007. It was tied to an issue with a mortgage crisis. Many homeowners found it difficult to pay their mortgages. The housing market collapsed. People who wanted to sell their homes owed more on their homes than the home was worth, so it was very difficult even to sell your home. Many banking and investment firms collapsed or were sold off in the 2008 recession. When you ultimately reflect back on the Bush administration, there's pros and cons. Accomplishments: he established the Department of Homeland Security, helped to bring the country together in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. The Patriot Act helped to create a stronger domestic security system. Perhaps his biggest accomplishment that kind of does not necessarily get the publicity that probably it deserves, he went into Africa and invested billions of dollars in AIDS treatment, education, and medicines to help save literally millions of African lives as a result of the medication. The economy was relatively strong from 2002 through the beginning of 2008. He developed a prescription drug plan for Medicare. Failures: this included the financial crisis towards the end of his presidency, the enhanced interrogation tactics, some allegations of waterboarding and torture, a slow or delayed response to Hurricane Katrina, and continued instability in the Middle East. Well, that kind of concludes our look at the Bush administration. Until next time, when we look at the Obama administration, Mr. Clarke is out.